So I missed this when this came up, but let me talk about this. This was posted by the New York Times in December 31, 2018. This only became a topic in Japan that I noticed earlier this week, actually. The editorial board, not a specific editor, this isn't a specific individual comment, this is the editorial board of the New York Times, came up, and where Japan had announced at the end of last year that it was resuming commercial whaling and leaving the IWC, which we all know was, it's complicated. Japan actually goes to the southern oceans. It hunts all sorts of different species of whales, endangered and non-endangered, as part of the scientific whaling program, to basically count and survey the numbers of the different whales, supposedly. They call it, at least that's the scientific purpose of the whaling. As a result, they kill hundreds of whales. The survey is government-sponsored. They need huge ships and so on. The government spent a lot of money sort of keeping this industry on life support. When they announced that they were resuming commercial whaling, ahead of the announcement, they took a lot of trouble, the Japanese government, to go to Australia, to contact Australia and America and explain to them that although it sounds terrible that where everyone is saying stop whaling altogether, what Japan is doing is by resuming commercial whaling, what they're going to do is they're going to only now do coastal whaling or whaling in the economic area around Japan. They're not going to go to the Southern Ocean or off Australia or anything anymore. And as part of commercial whaling quotas, they are not going to hunt, they say, endangered species. And of course, most whale species, or not most, but many of them are not. There are coastal minke whales and whatnot that are not endangered, and actually never have been endangered. There are many species of whales that have been endangered, and it's largely due to whaling. But in spite of the fact that there are species, and the Japanese government, so the proposal means that Japan will be killing less whales, and they'll only be killing them around Japan. And it also means that the government probably won't be subsidizing or sponsoring it anymore, which frankly means, given that no one in Tokyo, no one outside of a few towns with a history of whaling in Japan actually still eat whale meat, and the supposed safety concerns, so on, about whaling, or about whale meat, like for example that it's full of heavy metals and so on. I can sort of see this dying a slow death, frankly, by allowing it to return to commercial whaling. It's actually easier for the Japanese government to let it die off by cutting the subsidies and just and resuming. In a way, less whales are going to die. There are going to be no more endangered whales, so it can sort of be seen as a good thing. However, in spite of the explanations of the Japanese government, probably as you'd expect, all the nations, including the US, which have come out as being committed to being against all forms of whaling, they still have obviously condemned this. And the New York Times editorial board, what they've come out and they have said is, although Japan is in many ways a model global citizen on whaling, they've basically been acting inappropriately. They explain the history of the IWC and how it's basically how they've sort of continued whaling under the guise of scientific whaling, when basically most countries sort of agreed to convert the IWC from being a whaling management organization to a whale conservation organization, and Japan, being out of sync on that intent, basically decided to drop out. So they kind of dismissed the idea that there was ever scientific whaling. They point out that most of the world has moved on, but where they really kind of come down, they basically, there's a few points here which they sort of raised. They said, in the end, the Japanese government's decision to quit the commission is no more than a gambit by nationalist politicians to posture as defenders of the traditional way of life, akin to Trump's defense of coal mining. Well, that's kind of what they've been doing until now. The whole point is they're going to get rid of subsidizing this by doing this, but they know that they won't bring back an industry that has had its day or nobody needs any longer. Which largely is true, although there are still towns in Japan that do actually make their populations do live off whaling, including in Abe's own constituency. But I think the main arguments that they make against it are that basically, fewer than 1,000 people are employed by the industry, so basically the industry itself is dying, which again I think they're just going to allow it to die. It's pretty much the way that it's going to work. But they pretty much come down to the idea that there is no justification, commercial, cultural, or scientific, for killing these magnificent creatures. So they acknowledge that they're not endangered, but they come back to the idea that it's basically cruel and unnecessary. I still have a problem with this, which is that all meat consumption is cruel and unnecessary. The idea, we do like to think that our meat is sanitary. Like, I eat meat I grew up in country towns. I've hunted and I've eaten meat that we've hunted. I'm familiar with the unpleasantness of meat. We think of meat, it's only been within the last 100 years that we've been able to, our societies effectively through industrialized agriculture, we think of meat as something that comes very sterilized, that looks nothing like the animal that it's from, and polystyrene, wrapped sort of cases. I remember when I first went to Spain, and in most ham shops there, you see these legs of ham with still the hair and the skin and the hooves on it, and they cut it in front of you and give you the ham and put it in your sandwich. And I was shocked by that, but then it occurred to me, this is actually, the problems with me. One, that's where it comes from. The fact that they're allowing me to see it doesn't change the fact that that's what it was. It was an animal. They're just making that connection more visible, and it's really only been the last 100 years or so that people have totally lost that connection when it comes to meat, between the meat itself and where it comes from. And this is perhaps why the shock of the shock of that disconnection, that people, when they make those connections later in life, it's much easier to make the conclusion that it's basically unethical. And this is perhaps why we're seeing many more vegetarian, and I think ultimately that's where the way our species is absolutely going to go. The idea, I don't know. I've seen the PETA videos. I'm familiar with the common malpractices in abattoirs. There's hours of video if you ever go looking for it. And I don't recommend that you do, but at the same time, you should know where your food comes from. In terms of industrialized agriculture, in terms of emissions, energy consumption. It's bad for the environment. It's bad for the climate. It's we are over 100,000 years of evolution. We do eat meat, and I realize our bodies are well adapted. We like protein, but at the same time, we have people now rapidly, I think, changing and showing that people can live without it. I like meat and I continue eating it, but there again, what it comes down to me is, as cruel as killing any animal sort of is, in the end of the day, if you were going to choose the life of a very intelligent pig, and we know that pigs are more intelligent than dogs, they're as intelligent by some measures as some forms of apes, and you think about the lives that they have in industrial farms compared to the life of a minke whale. I would choose the life of the minke whale that was killed by a harpoon any day over a pig that was born and raised in an industrial farm that I eat every day. I think in the end of the day, this is all going to disappear, and maybe just within a couple of generations. I think it's been a real rapid move away from this, but I think that the only people in this debate that have the upper hand, who are right, who I will concede to, are the vegans and the vegetarians. I think eating meat and arguing somehow that whales are special and different, as a lot of people do, certainly in my own country they do. This idea that these are magnificent creatures and there's no cultural justification for it. Well, there's no cultural justification for eating pork, for example, if you ask me, or frankly any other kind of farm cow. So they did this, the New York Times, and they put out, again, what typically people that look like me, white people, sort of do, is we put out these sort of missionary colonialist ideas that you need to understand your culture is wrong. And I realize that sounds kind of apologist. At the end of the day, I've said this before, and I think the resumption of whaling is stupid. At least government support for it is stupid. But I think it should be allowed to actually go extinct naturally, which is what the industry is doing anyway, and I think that's the ultimate outcome. So yeah, in any case, the Japanese government felt compelled, not condemned, they felt compelled to write a response to the New York Times, which they did, in a way that you can be sure pretty much is not going to be accepted or understood by anybody. But this is what they said. Japan, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Japan wrote to the New York Times, and it was published, saying Japan is committed to the conservation of whales. So what they're saying is it sets catch limits based on methodology established by the AWC, and many whales species are not endangered, and Japan prohibits the hunting of those that are, which technically isn't true. They were hunting endangered species of whales as part of the scientific whaling program, but they've stopped that. So they seem to be saying it's not clear exactly what the quotas will be and what sort of whales they're going to allow catching of. But the government seems to be indicating that they will not be allowing hunting of endangered species, at least in the coastal whaling, that they're going to allow with the resumption of commercial whaling. So that's kind of some good news. They point out that this is going to be done around Japan. They point out that the IWC itself has deviated from its original purpose of regulating and supporting commercial whaling. And they point out it's unfair to point out Japan, and incorrect and the idea that it's basically a gambit by nationalist politicians, which it is. I think the New York Times is actually kind of right about that. But at the same time, this is very much what they can't say is that this is actually, I think, the Japanese government, frankly, cutting the whalers loose. It's ironic that by pulling out of the IWC and resuming commercial whaling, frankly, the Japanese government's kind of condemning the whaling industry to death here in Japan, because they're also going to yank the subsidies. So it's kind of good news from the whale's perspective, even though it sounds like the worst news possible. Yes, anyway, that is interesting, and that has been going through this week. At least this response was posted. It's been getting a lot of coverage in Japan anyway, and it makes Japanese at least aware of the fact that what they're doing is basically kind of embarrassing Japan to the rest of the world. And bear in mind that, like when Korea got the same hassle about eating dog meat, although allegedly you can still find it in Korea, the Korean government there moved pretty quick to actually make it illegal. It's kind of funny, Japan's always dug its heels in a bit more over eating whales, yeah, we'll see what happens with this, but I think it's going to die out on its own.